We are passing through Andromeda at the speed of light. We've made it. The whole universe is our new frontier.
Hi, and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time around, got a couple of old films and one new one for you. The old films are a couple of Roger Corman movies from the 1950s, so they're going to be fun. And the new one is a really interesting flick that looks at some of the issues that are being reflected in our modern times. So let's get started with the two Roger Corman movies. One from 1957, one from 1958. Both of them from the days when Roger Corman was doing a lean, mean operation. And the movies are, we'll ignore Not of This Earth, which is the third movie on this disc box set that I have, Attack of the Crab Monsters, and War of the Satellites. I'll talk about the third movie a little bit later, but they're the two Roger Corman flicks I've got for you. Attack of the Crab Monsters is the 1957 one. Stars Richard Garland, who was married to Beverly Garland for a while, but they were divorced by the time this movie came out. Pamela Duncan as the mandatory love interest. Russell Johnson, the professor from Gilligan's Island. And amongst other people, Mel Wells, who turned up as Mushnik in The Little Shop of Horrors in 1959. The movie was shot basically on Leo Carrillo Beach in Malibu, in the Marineland Aquarium in Los Angeles, and on Catalina Island a little bit. So they basically grabbed footage and grabbed locations where they could. Of course, they didn't have permission to do it, but that's just the nature of Roger Corman's operation at the time. It was lean and mean, and the whole movie cost $70,000. Which even in 1957 wasn't a lot of spondoolies. The story's got a lean, mean plotline. A group of scientists go to a remote island in the Pacific Ocean, which is not far away from where all the nuclear tests were done. It got some fallout, and a previous team had gone to the island to investigate some weird reports of strange animals, in particular worms. That previous team has disappeared. So a second team go to the island in a seaplane and start investigating, basically. Fortunately, there's a house on the island. It looks like they borrowed somebody's house up in the Hollywood Hills and just shot that with the reverse shots being on a beach, so it looked like it was on an island. Then some things start happening right from the very start. One of the sailors falls out of a boat as they're landing on the shore, and when they pull him out of the water, he doesn't have his head. Nobody's particularly fazed by the fact that you fall in the water and you come back up without your head. The Navy people drop off the sailors and the scientists on the island, and then the plane blows up as they're taking off to return back to base. Things start happening almost immediately. There are a lot of earthquakes on the island, and it looks like something's tunneling through the island, and parts of the island are collapsing into the ocean. Eventually, most of the island is collapsed into the ocean by the creatures that have evolved there because of the atomic radiation, which are a pair of giant crabs. These aren't your normal giant crabs. They're really, really odd giant crabs. The creatures they created for the movie look pretty good. They only created one, but they say that it's both of the crabs. So the giant crabs are about the size of a small sedan, not too large to manipulate for the movie. But these giant crabs have an edge. For a start, they're intelligent. For another thing, they're telepathic. And thirdly, when they eat your head, your mind becomes the mind of the crabs. So what's happening is basically the crabs are forming a group mind, and they're about to have a whole bunch of baby crabs and take over the world, because why the hell not? This is one of your basic, rudimentary, bare bones early Roger Corman movies. It runs a tight 62 minutes, so it's only just over an hour long. It cost 70 grand to make, and it made over $1 million. So it did really well. And there's a few things that Roger Corman does in this film that really help it pay off. For a start, all of his actors commit to the bit. They're dedicated to the absurdity of the story, and they really sell it. There's a lot of talking heads in rooms smoking cigarettes while there's some lab equipment on the side. There's a lot of walking around various pathways above beaches, looking down and saying what they're seeing, rather than showing what they're seeing. But again, the actors are committing to the bit, and they're selling the fact that suddenly there's a giant pit down below them, even though you can tell they're just looking down at the beach. And the spooky voices they give to the giant crab monsters are actually the voices of the actors whose characters have been killed. So the crabs are using the minds of the people they've absorbed to tell the survivors what's going to happen to them, and telling them basically the plan that the crab monsters have for taking over the world, because like James Bond villains, they really like to tell their victims what's going to happen. Of course, the scientists do some experimentation. They manage to cut the claw off one of the crabs, and they find out that if you zap the crab with electricity, it will disintegrate, which is kind of an odd vulnerability to have. And it probably means that crabs aren't seen much when there are thunderstorms around. We see a lot of bit players that turn up in early Roger Corman movies. People like Beach Dickerson, and Ed Nelson turns up as one of the Navy officers who gets blown up when the plane goes. It's kind of fun to see these familiar faces and knowing that they went on to have other things in their career. Russell Johnson went on to Gilligan's Island. Ed Nelson went on to doing a whole bunch of television, including Peyton Place in the 1960s. And this movie is one of the ones where Roger Corman figured out his formula. He said to Charles Griffith, the writer of the film, and also the producer, what I want is I do not want a scene in this movie that doesn't lead to either a shock at the end of the scene or the suspicion that a shocking event is going to happen. So each scene is a climax in a sense. And they also found out that having a title like Attack of the Crab Monsters sold the picture as much as anything else. It was a cheap movie made for the drive-in market, and in that it was honest in what it did. Oddly enough, in spite of its short running time, it was actually put together as a double feature with Corman's Not of This Earth. And that's kind of odd because a 62-minute main feature is a little bit odd, even for a drive-in movie. But they did, and it made $1 million. And like so many science fiction movies of the time, it's got an underlying theme. In fact, all three of these movies have underlying themes. And the underlying theme of Attack of the Crab Monsters is, we're testing nuclear weapons in the Pacific. What if we really stuffed up and we threatened the whole world by doing so? It's almost a cautionary tale. It could be unintended consequences of testing nuclear weapons at Bikini Atoll and Eniwetok and all those other places where they did test nuclear weapons. And the underlying theme, even though it wasn't particularly considered by Roger Corman and Charles Griffith, what if something happens we don't expect with this stuff going on? And in this case, it's giant telepathic crabs that absorb the minds of the people they eat and then undermine the island they're living in for no good reason so that they can reproduce in the ocean and populate the world with telepathic head-eating crabs. And that's kind of cool. I think there was that subconscious awareness that with nuclear weapons and also with testing nuclear weapons in particular, you can't control everything. Yes, you can let the blast off and you can have an idea of how far the blast is going to go. But there are always unintended consequences of new weaponry and new technologies used in this kind of way. And whether the military-industrial complex was aware of that, science fiction movies definitely were. And this was the first big success for Roger Corman as a producer. And he went on to great success for the next 60 years. That then brings us to the second movie, War of the Satellites, from 1958. Late 1957, November 1957 scared the shit out of America. And it scared the shit out of America for a very particular reason. Russia put up a satellite before they did. Sputnik 1 went around the Earth, and the Americans were a little shocked that the Russians beat them to the game. America had all of those scientists that used to be Nazis, but Russia got there first. And then they started doing stunts like they launched a satellite that went past Mars. And they also euthanized a few dogs in very creative ways by putting them into satellites and launching them around the Earth. And satellite was a buzzword at the time in the scientific community and also in science fiction circles. And so Roger Corman decides he's going to make a movie called War of the Satellites. And a special effects guy called Jack Quaid suggested to Roger Corman that the idea of making a film with satellites in the title, while satellites were still in the headlines, was a good idea. So Corman went to a producer called Steve Brody at Allied Artists and said to him, if you can give me $80,000, I'll have a picture about satellites ready to go in 90 days. And Brody says to him, what's the story? And Roger Corman says, I've got no idea, but I'll have your picture ready for you. And indeed he did. The movie's got a pretty good cast for a Roger Corman 1950s film. We got Dick Miller playing a guy called Dave, who's one of the scientists who's going to go up in the rocket ships that are being launched from Earth. but are inevitably being destroyed by some kind of weird barrier in space that stops them from orbiting the Earth or going to the moon or doing whatever else the rockets want to do. We also get Susan Cabot, who later turned up as the Wasp Woman, as another one of the scientists. Her name is Sybil, and Richard Devon playing Dr. Van Polder, who's the head scientist of the gig. We get a few other familiar faces in there as well, including Robert Shane, who played Inspector Henderson in the old George Reeves Superman series. He's playing one of the American representatives at the United Nations. So the story is this. Earth keeps launching rockets. They say satellites, but what they mean is rockets. And the rockets inevitably hit this barrier and get destroyed. And they've got like 9 of them, which are manned to get destroyed. So they've got 9 lots of crews that got killed. And the United Nations and America in particular is a little concerned by this because you can't keep throwing away astronauts like that. And they're about to launch their 10th one. They're going to send 3 rockets up, and the rockets are going to split apart and Voltron into a satellite that rotates and has gravity, all that kind of thing, and is going to be the main space base for America in particular. There is a spanner in the work. A small rocket lands in America, and a couple who are necking in a convertible find it because everything that ever came to Earth from outer space in the 1950s was found by a couple necking in a convertible out in the countryside. And this one's got a message from intelligences out in space, and the message basically says, you guys are immature as hell. Don't go into space. We will stop you. We built this barrier. You can't go into space. You're a whole bunch of reckless idiots, and we're not going to let you do it. America in particular, because of American exceptionalism, basically goes like that to these aliens who have proved that they are incredibly powerful and incredibly well scienced up. And they decide that if they get up to a certain speed, they can break through this barrier and the universe is their oyster. And they talk to the United Nations, and the United Nations reluctantly gives them an okie doke on that. But Dr. Van Polder, played by Richard Devon, who was a really striking looking actor, crashes and dies in a car accident. But one of the aliens replaces him. And this alien's got some pretty good powers. He's invulnerable to heat because he burns his hand with a blowtorch and doesn't get hurt by it. He can duplicate into multiple copies of himself, and he can kill people just by touching them. So lots of useful skills there. And the Dr. Van Polder replica tries to sabotage the space thing and it doesn't work. So he's going to go up in one of the 3 rockets and sabotage the mission while in flight. Meanwhile, Dave, played by Dick Miller, nuggety little Dick Miller, as opposed to 6'2" Richard Devon, has to go up against this alien as he slowly gathers the evidence that this guy is not totally kosher. There are a few things that tell him that that's the case. One is the fingerprints on both of his fingers are duplicated mirror image of each other. The other one is when he burns himself with the blowtorch and it doesn't hurt. And it doesn't hurt his skin and harm him in any way. And also his face is bilaterally perfectly symmetrical, unlike a normal human face. He searches around junkyards and finds the wreck of the original car in which the original Dr. Van Polder died. But he only gets this evidence in time for the rockets to launch. All 3 rockets launch. They Voltron together into a space station, which is done pretty well. The special effects on this for an $80,000 movie in 1958 are pretty good. They're not fantastic, but they're serviceable. And the spaceship itself, what they did was they built 4 archways to make the interior of the spaceship and move them different distances apart depending on whether it was a corridor or a main cabin area. They also had 2 reclining armchairs that were a very avant-garde design at the time as the couches that the astronauts are lying on to travel into space. That's it. It's better than Ed Wood Jr. had in Plan 9 from Outer Space, but it's still very rudimentary set design for a science fiction movie. But I love it. I love those couches. I would love to have one of those couches, to be honest with you. And I love the fact you keep seeing the same archways and the same flats as they move from one area of the spaceship to another. They just basically run down a corridor, cut, move the corridor around to make it longer, to have the next bit of the running through the corridor, cut, change the corridor again. There's a lot of that kind of stuff in there, and it's great. And it's something I looked for watching the movie. I thought, I want to see how many different ways they're going to use those same 4 or 5 pieces of set to tell the story, and they do it. And they do it pretty damn well. And Dick Miller's great as the nuggety and tough Dave. Richard Devon's creepy as Van Polder and the Van Polder alien. Susan Cabot's pretty good as well. If you want to look into the life of Susan Cabot, it ended quite tragically. But in this one, she's quite serviceable, even though she's basically there to fall over and scream and give Dave somebody to talk to, and as a not particularly well sketched love interest. The movie works, and it works because the actors again commit to the bit. The script is kind of rudimentary. No character is particularly well drawn. We don't know anything beyond the fact that he's Dick Miller about Dave. Van Polder we don't know much about. Sybil we don't know much about. But it doesn't matter. The movie's not long. How long is this one? 66 minutes. So again, not a long film. And it's trying to tell a hell of a story as well, just like Attack of the Crab Monsters. You're telling a big story with few resources. They're telling a story about going into space, building a space station, showing the construction of the space station as the Voltrons together, and also fighting the masters of the Spiral Nebula Ghana, which is what the place is called, who are cheesed off with the Earth. And again, there's an underlying theme here about American exceptionalism. And it's a subject that's been on a lot of people's minds lately. The fact that a very powerful entity says to the American space race, no, don't do it. You're not going off the Earth. You're not mature enough to be able to venture into space and meet aliens and become part of the greater society, because you're all a little bit random. And nobody on Earth, and particularly in America, takes this well. They don't like the idea of somebody saying no to them. And there's no diplomacy or negotiation. It's just the aliens say no. The Americans go, we're doing it anyway. And nobody says, listen, what do we need to do to satisfy you guys? What do we need to do to get you guys to take down the barrier? There's none of that kind of negotiation here. It's all basically my way or the highway from both sides. And that, again, is an interesting political subtext for the film, in that America at the time was the preeminent power in the world. And they didn't like anybody saying no to them. And they always saw it as a challenge rather than an opportunity to negotiate. And this movie very much has that kind of mindset. I like the fact that it shows the attitude that prevailed in the geopolitical world at the time. And it's a lot of fun too. The rockets look kind of cool. There's some really interesting production design. Dick Miller's in it, so it's never a bad thing. Dick Miller never made a movie worse in his life. And in this one, in the lead role, he does really, really well. And according to Dick Miller as well, the movie only took 10 days to film. So basically a week and 3 days. Everybody who was involved, from everything they've said, had a good time with it. Susan Cabot had a good time. Dick Miller enjoyed it. Richard Devon liked the film because he got to play 2 different characters. And he got to have a more complex character than a lot of the roles he had as a character actor. He turned up in the 1960s as a villain in one of the Matt Helm movies with Dean Martin. And so he enjoyed that. Everybody had a good time. The movie made money. The movie's still being talked about in 2025, so it's not a lose for anybody as far as I'm concerned. And rewatching it was enjoyable. I loved the resourcefulness with which it was made. And it had Dick Miller punching out a much larger guy. And that's always somewhat amusing. So they're the 2 Roger Corman movies I watched, which I enjoyed and had a great time with and loved and really appreciated. Then I went down to my local cinema and I saw Companion, a 2025 science fiction movie. Now, my local cinema, I've found out the secret. I've hacked the renovations at my local cinema. They now have some cinemas that have reclining seats. And when you look up the listings online to see what movies are showing at what time at the cinema, it has this little thing saying reclining seats. And not all the seats in the cinema are reclining. There's like 4 or 5 rows of reclining seats among 10 or 12 rows of cinema seats. So I went in there, I showed my Australian Film Critics Association card, And I said, can I have a reclining seat? And they went, no, you can't do it with these tickets because the complimentary tickets for reviewing don't link into that on the computer. But there's only 4 people in the cinema. So if you happen to wander into a reclining seat, you're not going to piss anybody off. So that's my hack. Just buy the ticket. Well, just get the ticket and then wait until the movie's almost started. And if there's nobody in the reclining seats, go for it. And I did that. I had a good time. Reclining seats are pretty good. They're not as good as the ones in the Reading cinemas down the road, but they're still pretty good reclining seats. So I saw Companion. Now, Companion is one of those movies that hits the zeitgeist. It's a science fiction thriller written and directed by Drew Hancock. It stars Sophie Thatcher, who was also in Heretic as one of the Mormon women, and Jack Quaid, son of Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan. You know him from The Boys. It also stars Lucas Gage and Harvey Guillen and Rupert Friend. And the trailer is mad. The trailer gives away one of the twists in this movie, but there are about 5 or 6 of them. The other 4 or 5, I'm not going to give away to you. So here it is. And by the way, I enjoyed the movie a lot. A young woman called Iris gets taken to a country house owned by a friend of a friend, a guy called Sergey, out in the countryside. And they're meeting some friends there. They're meeting a woman called Kat and a nice couple called Eli and Patrick, who are very devoted to each other and very, very cute. So they're on this isolated country house. They can't even get phone signal where they are. It's way out in the boonies. There's a bit of tension around. Kat doesn't seem to like Iris. And they settle down, they eat dinner, and the next day, Sergey tries to assault Iris down at the lakefront on the little beach they have at the lake. And Iris kills Sergey. So she comes back up to the house. She's covered in blood. Everybody's shocked as shit that all this has happened. And Sergey may or may not be a Russian mobster in a way. But then Josh tells Iris to go to sleep, and we find out she's a companion robot. She is basically a sex bot for Josh. And then the twists beyond that start happening. And I'm not going to tell you what the twists are. I'm going to tell you how the movie plays out, though. It becomes a battle between Sophie and Josh, where Sophie, having found out that she's a robot, has to try to ensure her own survival. And so it becomes a cat and mouse game where Josh, at first, seems to have the upper hand. He's got an app on his phone that can control Iris, but Iris finds ways around this. The other people at the lake house have secrets themselves, and it becomes a real life and death matter for a person. And Iris is the viewpoint character in this movie. It is a battle for survival for Iris. And we find more and more things about Josh. We find things about Eli and Patrick. We find things about Kat and Sergey, which complicate matters. Things get very gory, very bloody, and very funny as well. Even though this movie does have dark aspects to it, it's also got some very funny bits in it as well. Sophie Thatcher is fantastic in this film. She can carry a movie, as we found out when she was in Heretic. Fine actress. And she carries the movie really well as Iris. And Iris's arc, as she finds out more and more about herself and about her circumstances and about her life with Josh, really becomes, she's just great in it. Jack Quaid is great as Josh, and Jack Quaid has a likable persona in a lot of the things he does. We know him, of course, from The Boys and from a number of other things he did. He's got a likable persona, but like a lot of movies in current times, we see that that is indeed a persona. And Josh is a much, much darker and more bitter character than we first suspect him to be, because we're seeing him at all times through Iris's eyes. And there are some aspects to their relationship that have been created artificially for Iris. And the movie script handles that really well. The movie says slightly in an indefinite future as well, where companion robots aren't particularly unusual. Self-driving cars are definitely a thing. And the phones people use have all sorts of apps on them that can do things we can't quite do yet with apps. My advice is this: go and see the movie and have a great time. I haven't told you anything more than is in the trailer. And there is a lot more. There's a wonderful arc of Iris finding out who she is and, in a sense, finding her best self. There's the dark side to Josh. There's a lovely relationship with Eli and Patrick. There's the world in which they're set, where these companion robots have people who come out and repair them and service them and maintain them and things like that. There's a lot of that kind of world building in this movie that really does enhance the experience. And there are some assumptions about the companion robots that in particular Josh makes that aren't actually so. I had a great time with this film. I enjoyed it a lot. It does also look at that dark aspect of toxic masculinity, which is very much a theme in a lot of contemporary cinema. The Australian film Bird Eater that I talked about in the previous video has a lot of that toxic masculinity stuff in it. And there are some real world examples, particularly in France, of people, guys, let's just say men, treating their female partners in ways that are, over a very long period of time, monstrous. That is something that sits and exists in our real world. And we are getting fiction that's reflecting aspects of that with movies like Bird Eater and movies like Companion. And before anybody says, yes, they're man-bashing, no. That is something that men do in our real world. And if you can't handle that, then go back into your little box, because there are toxic men in the world. And the fiction we have, whether it's a drama like Bird Eater or whether it's a science fiction thriller like Companion, is inevitably going to reflect some of that aspect of the real world in which we live and the real crimes that are committed by men. You can't handle it, that's your issue. But having said that, the action's great. It's a good science fiction action film. Fantastic protagonist, fantastic antagonist, really good supporting characters who feel lived in. And the action's great. The plot twists are fantastic and are grounded, and none of them seems tacked on. They're all organically part of what happens. I really enjoyed Companion, even though, of course, it does have the dark aspect to it. I love the fact that movies can make those transitions well. It's not something that's easy to do, and it's something that can easily be done badly and take people out of the film rather than keeping them in it. But the comedic aspects and the horror aspects of this film blend wonderfully, and you should check it out. It's going to turn up on streaming fairly soon if you don't want to see it in cinemas. Everybody I know who's seen this film had a good time with it. So that's what I got for you this time around. A couple of old films, one new film, all of which talk to aspects of the world in which they're made, which shows that they're not just there to make bucks, they're actually there for people to inhabit. They're also there for people to think about the world in which the movies were made. Had a great time watching all of them. And that's probably the takeaway from this one. All of them are a lot of fun. So that's it for this time around. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. You can also support the channel by becoming a channel member, by donating through YouTube, or by becoming a patron at patreon.com/TerryTalksMovies. Occasionally I get giveaways when I do get some things from various movie distributors. In fact, just today, I sent away my copy of Eyes Without a Face as a prize for one of the people who supports the channel, and that went to Iceland. It's on its way to Iceland. This channel does have a very wide range geographically fan base, which I'm very, very grateful for. Next up, I've got the Monday video, and I've got a good idea of what I'm doing for that. I'm a last minute kind of guy when it comes to putting these videos out. So until all of that happens, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies, watch some old science fiction movies, but please don't neglect new ones. There's a lot of interesting stuff coming out, and I'm very, very happy about that. And I'm having a good time exploring that. So until you watch some new movies and some old movies, I'll catch you next time.